Hey everyone, great to see everyone here, or great to be here with you today. I'm Jennifer Zelnick. I'm a social work professor at Touro College in New York City, and I'm one of the 3 editorial team leaders at Affilia. And I'm so thrilled to be introducing the 3rd in our series of critical feminist social work roundtables. Today's roundtable is co-sponsored by New York College of Technology's Human Services Department, the Gender and Sexuality Studies, and Center for LGBTQ Studies at City Tech here in New York. If anybody needs to enable subtitles on your Zoom screen, please click live transcript. You can do that. Sorry, I'm a little discombobulated introducing everyone, so I hope you don't mind my informality. Before I get into those technical things, which I don't really have such a great handle on, I wanted to just tell you how excited I am that we're having this roundtable series today on reproductive justice. And this is obviously such a timely topic, and we'll hear about have a really engaged and thoughtful discussion today. But I wanted to highlight 3 recent articles that have been in our journal. One is just out in the online only right now, Barriers to Achieving Reproductive Justice for an Indigenous Gulf Coast Tribe by Jessica Little and Selena Doria. And then in the current issue, we have From Abortion Rights to Reproductive Justice, a call to action, which is authored by Erica Goldblatt-Hyatt, who you'll meet in a moment, Judith McCoy, and our own Mery Diaz, who I'm going to introduce in just a second. In the same issue, we also have Examining Social Work Student Knowledge and Attitudes About Abortion and Curriculum in Social Work by Heather Witt, Maha Jonas, Erica Goldblatt-Hyatt, again, and Carly Franklin. So I just wanted to take a moment to introduce you guys to some of the current scholarship that we're featuring in the journal. And we're really using these roundtables to highlight that work, to go deeper into that work, and to build the community of scholars engaged in these discussions. So now back to the nuts and bolts for today. You'll be using the Q&A function for questions for the panelists. And I mentioned clicking the live transcript link. So I think that's all I have to tell you. Oh, except that we're also going to have a recording of this session, which will be on the YouTube channel tomorrow. And we'll share that link with you. And this way, you can share this with classes and share it with colleagues. So it'll be a great way to spread this work even further. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce Mery Diaz. Mery is Associate Professor in the Human Services Department at City Tech, the New York City College of Technology, which is part of CUNY here in New York City. Her work examines young people's minoritized, racialized, and gendered social work experiences, school mental health issues, and social justice. She's a co-editor of Narrating Practice with Children and Adolescents, published in 2019. And that's actually how I met Mery, when she was celebrating the publication of this book. So that was a happy occasion. And after that, she joined the editorial board of Affilia, Feminist Inquiry and Social Work. And you're going to hear more about the recent co-authored publication, From Abortion Rights to Reproductive Justice, today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mery.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zelnick. I would also like to welcome everyone here with us today. And I am so honored to be a part of this conversation with our 3 esteemed panelists, Dr. Zakiya Luna, Dr. Stephanie Vegan, and Dr. Erica Goldblatt-Hyatt. Before I introduce them in their bios, I want to begin the conversation by sharing a very brief background on reproductive justice, just to set the stage for today's conversation. So reproductive justice is an intersectional movement and framework emerging from the activism of Black women during the late 1990s and the subsequent formation of Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective. This group of activists, frustrated with mainstream feminism's narrow focus on abortion rights and practice, set out to problematize choice and shift the discourse toward broader social justice claims, noting that the most vulnerable, people of color, those who are poor, those who are under the surveillance of the state, do not have the privilege of privacy, nor the means to make free decisions about their bodies and reproduction. Loretta Ross, a founder of Sister Song, wrote, There are pre-existing conditions long before pregnancy occurs. One of the fundamental problems addressed by reproductive justice is the isolation of abortion from other social justice issues that concern communities of colors, issues of economic justice, the environment, immigrant rights, disability rights, discrimination based on race and sexual orientation, and a host of other community-centered concerns. So in this light, reproductive justice focuses on access and reproductive health resources, but also centers on the collective experiences of the most vulnerable, people who are racially marginalized and those who are oppressed and minoritized in multiple ways. This means working beyond the right to choose, but also for racial, gender, economic, and environmental justice, working toward liberatory aims and for access to quality healthcare for everyone. The central tenets of reproductive justice are upholding the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, the right to parent children with dignity and in safe and healthy environments, and the right to sexual and body autonomy. So this brings us to this conversation today as we examine the role of social work in working towards these aims. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Zakiya Luna, Dr. Stephanie Begun, and Dr. Erica Goldblatt-Hyatt to join us in this conversation. I want to share Dr. Luna's bio with you. Dr. Luna is the Dean's Distinguished Professorial Scholar in the Department of Sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. Her areas of research are social change, sociology of law, health, and inequality. She is interested in social movements, human rights, and reproduction, emphasizing the effects of intersecting inequalities within and across these sites. She recently published Reproductive Rights as Human Rights, Women of Color and the Fight for Reproductive Justice with New York University Press, and more recently, Black Feminist Sociology, Perspective and Praxis with Whitney Pirtle on Routledge Press. Dr. Luna was also the lead author of Reproductive Justice Review article in the 2013 volume of the Annual Review of Law and Social Science, and is the co-creator and former co-editor of the University of California Press book series, Reproductive Justice, A New Vision for the 21st Century. Welcome. Dr. Stephanie Begun is an assistant professor at the Factor Inwantage School of Social Work at the University of Toronto, where she also co-founded and co-directs the Youth Wellness Lab, a research collaborative that convenes academic researchers, community-based partners, and youth with a shared goal of improving services and outcomes across multiple intersecting domains by, with, and for youth. Dr. Begun's experience in reproductive justice policy and community organizing prompted her commitment to an academic career in social work research and advocacy. Her scholarship focuses on improving family planning access, education, and outcomes among equity-seeking youth populations, with particular attention paid to youth experiencing homelessness. And last but not least, Erica Goldblatt-Hyatt. Dr. Goldblatt-Hyatt is an associate teaching professor and acting director of the DSW program at the Rutgers University School of Social Work. She is an administrator, clinician, author, and activist. She's one of the few specialists in the United States working with people and families who have ended a pregnancy due to fetal anomaly. Her collaboration on the ACCEPT model and double rainbow approach are the only interventions available for social work and mental health clinicians to support this group specifically. She works with those across the spectrum of perinatal loss, perinatal and baby loss, and also specializes in infertility. She is passionate about reproductive justice and has been frequently welcomed to advocate for abortion access alongside Pennsylvania Governor Tom Wolf. Welcome to our panelists. Today we have asked our panelists to consider 3 questions, and we will begin with the first of those questions. To our panelists, can you share a bit about yourself and how you came to reproductive justice work? Any of you are welcome to answer first, whoever feels most comfortable going.
I'd love to get out of the gate and get this part out of the way. So thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here and so grateful that this is timely with the release of the article that we worked on, Mary. So this is great timing. I am not an unbiased observer or participant when it comes to the field of reproductive rights and justice. 10 years ago this July, I was expecting my first child. And like most expecting parents, I didn't know a whole lot about the 20-week anatomy scan or really the purpose and nature of any of the prenatal tests that I was experiencing because nobody really told me about them. My understanding was that I was going to a second trimester ultrasound so I could learn the sex of my baby. What they found on that scan was that my growing fetus did not develop an airway. And so that means where his trachea was supposed to be was just blunted off, and fluid, amniotic fluid that should have been expelled through the mouth back into the womb was building up inside his body. And what that did was balloon his lungs and place enormous pressure on his heart and effectively crushing it and flipping his diaphragm upside down. I came to find out that this was an anomaly that affects 1 in 50,000 births. And while it appears on a spectrum, there's very little that can be done when this happens. I wasn't planning to have an abortion when I found out, and so I sought consultation of a fetal surgeon who indicated to me that if this child did not die in the womb, he would be born brain dead. If he lived, he would spend life in the NICU and eventually a long-term care facility. Given where the lesion was in his anatomy, he simply wasn't eligible for fetal surgery or for any special procedures that could help him breathe on his own after birth. So the birth process would ultimately lead to time without oxygen to be able to get to his brain. My husband and I made the heartbreaking decision to end our pregnancy, and my career then took a hard left because I realized how little literature was out there about this issue, how little psychotherapeutic support was out there, and how much more was needed. I realized how much stigma there is for pregnant people who make the choice to end a pregnancy. And I realized more and more as I lived beyond the pregnancy, how targeted our group is by ridiculously restrictive legislation. So I decided to become a researcher and psychotherapist and public activist and focused on helping people understand the personal stories behind those who have later abortions, collecting those stories, speaking those stories, and supporting those who want to speak, as well as those who are terrified of speaking because of the huge judgment and misunderstanding. As I began to do more of the work, I can tell you a little bit later about my contributions to scholarship. I came to appreciate that there is a distinct difference between people like me who had a later abortion, who's safely accessed one in a hospital system with compassionate caregivers in a timely manner. Because remember, when you're diagnosed at 20 weeks, you don't get a whole lot of time, depending on the state you're in, to get to where you need to be to have an abortion. And in fact, up till today, literally today, there are fewer and fewer places that will provide abortions. Despite Roe v. Wade still hanging by a thread, these unconstitutional bans have proliferated, and I'll have some examples later as to what some of those look like. So I came to realize that the people telling stories and standing up and coming for therapy were people who looked a whole lot like me, well-resourced. And while I do identify as non-binary, I don't present as non-binary. So that's something that I've really struggled with in terms of how we can create better access and support for people who have uteruses, but do not identify as female and enter into a pregnancy experience. We know that there are populations who have terrible access to prenatal care to begin with when we live in a country with horrific Black maternal morbidity and mortality and terrible access to prenatal care, or even the option of fetal surgery for people who don't have the resources to fly to Children's Hospital for consultations. People who are able, maybe there are people who are unable to drop $15,000 cash up front to get an abortion in Colorado at the last minute, plus childcare, plus transportation, plus lodging. I could go on and on. So the longer I work in this field, the more impressed I am by the serious access issues that face people who are ending pregnancies, but also people who have bodies that can get pregnant that we are legislating. And this legislation is happening mostly by way of conservative white male ideology, by the same people who forcibly sterilize immigrants and other people of minority status, by the people who make it very hard for insurance to cover abortion, as well as fertility treatments, so that people can grow their families. And these are people who have never walked our path. And for the past 10 years, an anger has grown within me. especially as the field of social work has been largely silent about this. I've been grateful. I ended up at Rutgers with a mentor, Dr. Judith McCoy, who's done a lot of clinical and research work on this, but our work is not enough. And while the reproductive justice community grows and starts to connect, our connective tissue becomes stronger, what we need now to improve the situation is the vocal, unapologetic advocacy of social work students, social work professors, CSWE, BSW students. We are calling upon you to see the humanity in this problem and to help work towards a more just and equitable approach to reproduction. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erica.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And it's such an honor to be in the space with all of you. I'm really thrilled to be invited to this. I admittedly think I'm about to test positive for COVID, so I'm kind of declining as I sit here. I'm noticing more and more as my voice is going, so I apologize if I end up coughing or if my COVID brain immediately takes over, but I'm so thrilled nonetheless to be here. I actually came into reproductive justice work long before I had a full picture of what social work actually really is. So I'll answer maybe in a bit of a reverse order. I grew up in rural Minnesota and South Dakota, and because there were really few community-based agencies and providers, service providers of any kind, and even the schools I grew up going to didn't have a designated school social worker. It was always like a guidance counselor who also doubled as like the basketball coach or something. So I had this really limited interaction with social work as a field and a narrow view of what social workers even do until much later in life. I initially thought that social work was primarily child welfare focused, and or social workers were involved in things that I didn't see myself really wanting to be a part of, more like surveilling and gatekeeping kinds of roles. So that's where I started. But growing up in this area, in this part of the world, was really deeply informative to what I continue to care about today in my development. It was politically and socially just so conservative. And I definitely was a fish out of water from day one. My parents were young parents when they had me, so I grew up feeling and interacting with the stigma that they faced for that. And I was so shaped by the anti-choice organizing and rhetoric and billboards that were just so pervasive all around me growing up. So it was early thing that I sort of questioned and had an early passion for. So then flash forward to years later, my primary passion in life, education-wise, was always in the area of political and social thought. And my undergrad is what focused in that area, but I wanted to take things a bit farther than just the thought part. I was really interested in getting more involved in the action part of policy change and social change. So I started out as a volunteer for years at Planned Parenthood, first as an options counselor, and then eventually making my way into the public affairs department. And then as they got to know me more, it became my actual day job and paid employment and full-time work. So I was sort of a community organizer and policy specialist hybrid at Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains in Denver, which is where I lived most of my adult life prior to moving to Toronto. And I initially did come into this work because of my passion for abortion rights, but then in working at Planned Parenthood and just seeing the many different communities and intersections, I really started to develop a more complete picture of what reproductive justice is and the intersectionalities therein as that work unfolded over time. My work involved a lot of youth-led organizing. I did a lot with both state and federal level policy change, though a disproportionate amount of my time, each and every state election cycle, was devoted to fighting personhood amendment challenges that were brought up every time. Colorado had a really unique and low threshold for number of petition signatures that were required to get something on the ballot. So it was kind of this Trojan horse state whereby lots of things were attempted, and personhood being one of them. So I worked on a lot of those campaigns, which was just, really an effort at chipping away at our resources, at organizing of the community, and really eventually chipping away at Roe. So I organized phone banks, canvassing, lobby days, all of that. And it really was my dream job. It still probably was my favorite job ever. And I missed so much of it. But I also sort of outgrew it over time, because I realized that I also had this concurrent passion for more intensive and in-depth research and policy specifically. So around this time, I'm talking to all of these people doing this fascinating work in the community, and I'm starting to pick up on that more and more of them have MSWs, and it was starting to reshape my view of what maybe social workers do and what social work is about. So doing a lot more research, I realized that social work is actually about social movements and community change and social change and policy. And that's how I much later in life then found myself in an MSW program. And then I really went down the research vortex and continued on to the PhD and now tenure track faculty role in social work, and where my work is really throughout this entire continuum focused on elements of reproductive justice and young people in particular ever since. And then on top of that, I moved to Canada. So now I'm learning all of these contexts and policies and how these issues compare and contrast in a whole extra country and setting. So thank you again for inviting me today.
Thank you for sharing that, Stephanie. Zakiya?
Yeah, thank you, Erica and Stephanie, for starting us off. And I get asked this question a lot about sort of how I came to reproductive justice. And I guess I have two answers, because one of them for me is that, I was raised by a single mom who had a kid as a teenager. And I always knew from a really young age that like something was wrong with our family, not because she thought that, but because of public images and discourses around a range of things, right? So, and particularly because we were a Black family, right? So for me, like, it was always understood that like not everybody's reproduction is appreciated in the same way, right? So when I formally learned about reproductive justice, it was like, oh, right, gave a language to something that already existed, right? And certainly I had been interested, and I'd been raised actually to be interested in activism. I still remember from a young age, we were at like anti-apartheid rallies and a whole range of things, right? Like, and so we were raised with an ethos of understanding that like, it is our responsibility to contribute to the community. And so of course, the further along I went in my life, the more I learned that many people, that's just not the case, right? And particularly in schooling settings, right? Because they were predominantly white settings and a whole set of spaces where people aren't thinking about community. They aren't thinking about structures and systems, but that was something that was, literally from birth, just been part of how my family thinks about the world. And yeah, but then when I sort of formally came to research reproductive justice, and when I formally came across the term was actually in graduate school. I was there in a joint program in sociology and women's studies at Michigan. And I was already interested in understanding activism by Black women and more broadly by women of color, coalition spaces, all of that. And I just had the fortune to be on a project that was looking at sort of global feminisms and the many sort of manifestations and ways that feminist activists were trying to realize their vision of gender justice. And it was US, India, Poland, and China. And I was on the US site that at the time, Elizabeth Cole was directing, and I had the fortune of being a research assistant on the project. And right towards the end of it, and the last two interviews were Adrienne Ash, who has now since died, but she was a bioethicist, really raised questions around thinking about reproduction and disability. And then the other interview was Loretta Ross. And so I was, formally in charge of sort of helping do administrative aspects of their interviews, because those were in-person interviews. They'd come to a studio in Michigan and get interviewed, and there was an audience. And Liz, I will forever thank her for this, said, I think you should actually interview Loretta Ross. And I was like, oh, okay. So for anyone out there in the audience who's really interested in seeing a much younger version of me doing an interview with Loretta Ross, you can find that online, in part because the Global Feminism Project was actually designed around pedagogical use, and the idea from the beginning was everything would be open access. And so it's a great sort of resource, and it's expanded to other countries. And so that's where I sort of formally learned the term reproductive justice. Was, I said, it really sort of describes something that I was always like sort of understood, right? That reproduction and the concerns aren't just about abortion, even though that's how it was being presented in the media, right? They're about what resources you have to raise your families, right? What healthcare you do, or in many cases do not have access to help keep those children alive, right? And so for me, it's something that's always been present, even if there wasn't always the language in which to describe it. And I am, the outlier of this group in the sense that, like, I have an MSW, and I actually, I got it while I was getting a PhD, because I wanted a different way to think about movements. And I appreciated the sort of community organizing approaches that were being offered. And I knew multiple people who I thought were doing sort of cool work at the doctoral level in social work, and was like, oh, okay, social work is all about social justice and structures and all that. And when I got there, I learned that certainly that was what was many faculties' hope would be integrated. And, there were many ways they were doing that at Michigan, but that many of the students, their main interest was around interpersonal practice and children and youth, and the rest didn't matter. And it was always fascinating to me that people would literally say that they didn't care about the parents, right? Like their thought was around understanding, and for many people, kind of saving children, right? And this wasn't like 40 years ago. This was, well, I'm not going to give the exact years, but and so that was part of the reason why I didn't go any further in social work. I wasn't interested in only thinking about sort of how do I help people navigate basically fucked up systems, but like, how do we actually change those systems, right? And I think that for me, but I will say there was some super important things for me with my MSW, in that because I was going in at a later time and very intentional about sort of what sort of skills and spaces, I did get my placement with a national reproductive healthcare provider. And it was really important to be in that space because, one, seeing sort of direct services, right, and the range of work and the things that people were trying to do to make sure that people had reproductive health care. And this was in Michigan, which at that time was actually still sometimes blue, a little purple, different than now. And also understanding that even within movement spaces, there's still a lot of education to be done, because there were times where people who were doing work around direct provision weren't so clear on sort of why policy mattered, right? And yet policy is the thing that is impacting what most social workers are actually doing on the day-to-day in so many spaces. And so, and also just the complexity of the different motivations people have in these spaces. And that was really important because of the sort of later work I would do regarding the reproductive justice movement, which I'll talk about more in the next question. But really getting at that sort of movement spaces are really complicated. And the media representations, and even sometimes their own internal representations, are a bit too simplified to really get at sort of what it is folks are trying to do in reproductive health rights and justice spaces. And so the sort of importance of really having honest, tough conversations about what those histories are and what brings people to the table, both personally and professionally, being so important. So I will end there.
Thank you all. I think it's so important to hear your personal journey into this work and how much our personal experience also contribute to our scholarship and the type of work that we do or we commit ourselves to for life in some sense, right? Or how we might come to it later later on, sometimes it's not a clear line. So I think it's really important and significant to hear about these journeys. I would like to move on to the next question, and more of a focus on your scholarship and what you see as the major contribution or focus of your reproductive justice scholarship. It could be the same order or a different order, whichever way.
Happy to start again. So the RJ scholarship itself, for me, I've just really started delving into. I hope at the end of my career, people will have more resources than they started off with when it comes to RJ and access. But I started off writing case studies and creating clinical models for therapists, specifically social workers who are working with people who have ended unwanted pregnancies, to really help give them a background and a baseline understanding of what the unique grief of this group looks like. And then I started really branching out and writing some more models for therapists who are working with people who have ended unwanted pregnancies and are subsequently pregnant, and what that anxiety looks like, just to provide, again, some sort of clinical guideline and a place where clinicians feel empowered to do this work, because it's a population that is incredibly hesitant to show up to therapy, given all the stigma that they experience. So if there's some models out there and we can help really incorporating evidence-supported interventions like CBT or exposure therapy that therapists are comfortable with, maybe we'll have a better chance of supporting the mental health of these individuals. But recently, I have really shifted to formally address RJ, just as we did in the Affilia article. And I'm also currently involved in a qualitative study, interviewing fetal surgeons, really drilling down to their understanding of who the fetal patient is. And that, of course, as well, who has access to fetal surgery is certainly an implication of reproductive justice. One of the things that I do frequently is train obstetricians, nurse practitioners, gynecologists, maternal fetal medicine providers, and genetic counselors, all about what is involved in the process of taking care of abortion patients. So I have a website called TFMR, and what that really has is printables and worksheets and handouts and videos for providers who are doing medical work and need a little bit more information about why later abortion patients are different and why they need special care. And one of the things that I really hone in on that site is informed consent and the principle of autonomy that I think really cuts across the work of reproductive justice. So as I mentioned earlier in my own story, what comes up frequently when I talk to later abortion patients is the nature and purpose of prenatal testing is not really made clear at most OB appointments. You know, when you come for your first OB appointment, there may be a discussion of doing some blood work, doing some ultrasounds, but there's never really a discussion of what information prenatal test will provide you with and what you might want to do with that information. So certainly when our testing is getting more advanced, but our patients are not understanding the nature of those tests, they're going to be really surprised when an anomaly, chromosomal anomaly pops up, or perhaps a structural anomaly on anatomy scan. So it really behooves providers to provide information about what these tests do into an into an informed consent, like a prenatal informed consent or an advanced directive, to really ask people, what would you do if your child was affected by an anomaly like XYZ? Would that be a pregnancy you would want more information about? Have you or your partner ever talked about this? If you have a partner, is this a pregnancy you want to continue? Because frequently people report to me that they got their abortions later because they weren't given permission. They would have liked to have heard that it was okay for them to end the pregnancy, and instead they were bounced from referral to referral. And for those without equitable access, oftentimes it was extremely hard to find a provider to do a second opinion, even when my patients were ambivalent about carrying the pregnancy itself. So to finally be told explicitly, yes, abortion is an option, and then you're hitting the state deadline for when you can have an abortion, that's a real problem. So informed consent is really necessary. And autonomy really involves explaining right off the bat what options are. And can your patient understand those options? Can they choose from other options? Do they understand the implications of the options that they choose? And are they making their decision free of coercion? I have patients who have inserted I have physicians who have inserted their own biases and withheld information on abortion, or made comments like, you don't want to abort this child, or they withhold information because they feel that a patient should or should not have another child, and that's implicitly tied to their biases about who their patients are racially, socioeconomically, and so on. And that's not informed consent. So we really need to engage in this like radical informed consent where our patients feel empowered to choose abortion and to know that abortion is an option right from the very beginning. So I do a lot of that with medical professionals, also talking about how are the ways that we can support the community resources that we offer to clients. As we know, Medicaid does not pay for abortions oftentimes. We have individuals who have a great deal of trouble accessing timely prenatal care. So what can our clinicians do? What can social workers do to help our clients cut across these really restrictive legislative barriers that come up when a person is coming to you? So a lot of the work that I'm doing right now really centers around that information and helping to really empower those first step providers to be able to provide more comprehensive, accessible abortion care.
Great, thank you. Stephanie or Zakiya?
Sure, I can jump in again. Do we want to keep the same order? Okay, that works. Yeah, that's fascinating work. It's so important too. I think for me, just that I survived and I'm thriving as a critical feminist scholar focused on RJ research is really something in and of itself. When I first started my doctoral studies, I was told by at least several senior social work scholars across numerous institutions that I should either change my focus since issues of family planning and reproductive health weren't really social work topics, or if that's what I really wanted to do, that maybe I should consider getting a PhD in public health instead. I was warned that it might be too hard to, for me to get a job with this focus in social work, that some might find the conversation or the topic too controversial. And that it would be really hard for me to find a mentor specific to social work who I could work with in this area. So that was really discouraging. It made me very much not want to continue. But I think being told no to anything is sort of like a triple yes. So that's, so I continued. It's almost like a challenge. And I was really fortunate to be connected with some fantastic mentors who do a lot of work with young people, which was sort of the other area that I was really passionate about. I'd worked in after school programs, and obviously I'd mentioned that I'd done a lot of youth organizing experience. So just that there was someone willing to take me on and mentor me, kind of despite being this supposed misfit in social work doctoral studies was something. So kind of day one of doctoral program, I was in a shelter for youth experiencing homelessness because we were piloting a study that my mentor was running, and the group of young people who I then stayed in touch with longitudinally because it was a longitudinal study, just really opened up my eyes to how that particular group of young people was experiencing so many aspects of reproductive justice every single day. It was everything I'd really thought about in my work at Planned Parenthood, times a million within this population, just really challenging access, lack of services and affirmative services to connect them to information and supports that they really needed. So I have really continued to focus a lot of my work with this group, and this group has also then opened so many other hallways of exploration too. I just continue to be so furious in my work and my conversations, specifically with youth experiencing homelessness who identify as LGBTQ, especially trans and non-binary young people, just being left out of the conversation, left out of interventions, just being treated as though they couldn't possibly become pregnant or parents, or they don't need contraception, or they're never going to navigate abortion decision making. And a lot of the service providers who are telling them these things are social workers, which I find infuriating. So we have a lot more work to do to make sure that these experiences are not so shaming and judgmental, or that they don't even want to attend anything at all. So, I think that a lot of my work has also branched off into a number of different things too. We don't live siloed lives. So of course we shouldn't approach reproductive and sexual health as though it's in this, tidy container of sorts. So my work has since expanded to think about other dimensions of health and wellness, and then also a lot of different approaches to work. I started out with a lot of mentorship and more quantitative research, which I still do some of. It moved into more critical qualitative health work, and now I'm doing so much more that's arts informed and participatory, and I find that it speaks to everyone, I think, who participates in it, but especially young people. They are so smart and so creative, and just making research so it's not miserable and punitive to participate in is really is meaningful. And I'm just trying to reject sort of these positivist notions of what knowledge creation looks like, and that anyone who creates or shares anything with us is valuable knowledge and information that informs actually how they see the world, not how we're asking them about the world, because we generally tend to miss important things if we're not in their shoes, which we're not. So my work has morphed all over the place into other arts-based methods, which really I've become so passionate about. So doing things like improv comedy, digital storytelling, and photo voice, and a bit with human-centered design as well with young people, and really trying to focus more and more on youth-led research as I continue. So one other thing that I did early in my doctoral studies too, because I was angry, I think, about being told that this was not a social work topic, was to explore, well, maybe I'm wrong, maybe it isn't a social work topic. Maybe social workers don't think reproductive justice is a social work issue. And I think this is something that happens in these colonial and patriarchal structures. They make you start to question, well, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I don't even know what I'm talking about. So I think that was something that was important that I did at that stage, was develop along with a group of other folks who were passionate about this area too, who I was so fortunate to connect with early. We created a nationwide survey of social work students, just asking them, like, do you see these issues? How do you see these issues? How are you trained to work and grapple with these issues in practice? And mostly because I had never had a conversation in most of my social work classes about any of these topics. So I wondered if everyone else was experiencing that, or we would talk about them because I would bring them up because it was my area of passion. But it usually takes someone to bring it up, or to care about it in order for that to happen. So we did this project, and it resulted in quite a number of papers. And we did find that people were identifying all sorts of aspects of reproductive justice as coming up in their practice. Most of them hadn't been trained to work with these issues. And then what was more alarming is that some of them were saying, well, because I didn't know how to work with it, I just went with my own personal views on how to guide them. And we know what that can mean for ethics and for really problematic outcomes. So I think that's something that's just really important for us to continue to foreground in social work education, like being more intentional about having those conversations and making it maybe more part of our curriculum. And just shout out to Affilia as well. The very first article that I ever wrote is actually the one that that is being featured here. I started it as an MSW student, and I think it was actually like a top 3 reason that I maybe didn't quit my PhD program is that my article on ambivalent sexism theory and anti-choice attitudes was actually published in a feminist and social work related journal, no less. That it was like, okay, there is a space for this voice, and there is a home. And through that, it developed a network of people who I realized really deeply care about this too, who are social workers And it is exciting to see that, now there are special interest groups at SWIR, for example, in reproductive justice, and that the number of people exploring these topics is growing quite a bit. Maybe they were always there and they needed like a mass to the connective tissue, I think, as you said, Erica, to strengthen us. But, we have a long way to go, because we're doing we're continuing to do some messed up things as well as a profession. So that's kind of how it started, how it's going.
Great. Thank you. Zakiya?
Yeah. Sorry, the reason I was laughing is because when you were saying like, oh, we're continuing to do some messed up things, there was NAPW had the webinar yesterday about social work and abolition. And they felt like the vast majority of the chat was like people like, this is all messed up. Like, what do we do? But I think it's actually good that social work is having these conversations more explicitly. Because I think that there's a lot of sort of structural issues and sort of thinking about who sort of has the power in social work and what power they hold in people's lives, right? But when I think about like my major contributions or focus in my scholarship, again, two answers, but I mean, the first one I'm going to say is actually like, and this is because this is always really important to me, like sort of opening doorways for other scholars. I mean, my first article on reproductive justice was published 13 years ago when I was in grad school. And it was from my MA, and it was about Sister Song. And of course, at that point, Sister Song had already published like its own volumes, and Undivided Rights, which is amazing. And of course, there are people publishing on reproduction and sociology in so many fields. But as far as publishing on the reproductive justice movement as a movement and possible lessons learned, and I say this, and I still have never had no one as far as I know, right? Like as far as social peer-reviewed articles, like that was the first sort of peer-reviewed article that was really looking in the movement as a movement, right? And not just what some people thought like, oh, it's derivative of reproductive health and rights. And like, there's an element in which certainly reproductive justice movement was influenced by that, because there were many folks who were working in those spaces or trying to work around reproductive rights and reproductive health and finding it lacking. But folks are also working in anti-violence spaces and critical criminology, anti-carceral spaces, right? And bringing reproduction into those spaces, right? So really about understanding what does it mean to think about like intersectionality around structures, obviously, and then the movement work that has to be done, right? The coalition work that has to be done to actually address the sort of problem of reproductive oppression. And so, I mean, it feels weird because I don't feel like old enough to be like, oh, I have like legacy of like students, but like there's weird things of saying like, people will be like, oh, yeah, there it is. There's the article. Like reaching out to me, like one still citing that article. And I'm like, I definitely have had others since then. But also just like that it helps for other people to legitimize for them, right? That this is valid. And that's, as far as how the academy goes, like if it needs to be peer reviewed, right? Like it can be fine that like movements have done their own publications, but like, if you want to study this, like, show us that there's some other folks out there who are doing that. And that helping, and obviously there's other people who've been doing it since then, but like that being what I think of like really important contribution, but part of the way doing that has been through certain publications. And I have the like the annual review of law and social science edited volume for this review piece that Kristen Luker and I did when I was a postdoc at the Center on Reproductive Rights and Justice at Berkeley Law. And there's some notes in the bottom of it about some of the process, because that's also important to me in thinking about process. And don't always get it perfectly. But while I was a postdoc at that center, I created a reproductive justice, working group. And yes, there were many academics in it, but there were also people in it who were with community organizations, right, who wanted to learn more about reproductive justice. And, we got together every couple of weeks and we had snacks and we did these different things, and we did a convening at the end, and actually the posters up there with, Loretta Ross and Samara Azam, who was at the time, the executive director of Access Reproductive Justice, which was a reproductive justice oriented abortion fund at the time. And Sujatha Jesudasan, who's just a brilliant movement thinker and strategist and been doing so much work. She and Dorothy Roberts have published some pieces in thinking about reprogenetics and all of that. And so for me, it's like doorways and spaces, and helping document a history. Again, to be clear, folks in the RJ movement have been doing their own documenting, but one of the things about being in movement, right, is that there isn't necessarily always that time for reflection. So when I was doing my early dissertation research, like there are people who are like, yeah, I never really got to talk about sort of how I came to this work, right? You know, in this broader sense, or think broadly, like, you know, what do I imagine as the future of reproductive justice, or what does human rights really mean, right? Because that was part of my real interest in that, like this phrase human rights gets connected to reproductive justice, but as a country that for the most part doesn't really want to recognize human rights, like what does that really mean? And so also just providing that space. And it's been fun to, you know, since the book, Rights is Human Rights, since this has come out, I mean, certainly you give like academic talks, but also like talking with people in different movement organizations and spaces, and people who have book clubs, you know, that are doing different things. And like the questions they ask for me are like just so interesting and different from the questions I get typically in sort of academic spaces. And so those partnerships have also been, for me, like sort of a big contribution in the sense of like showing that that is possible. Now it's can be really challenging, particularly for pre-tenure, and it's not, well, there's different ways for things to look and different ways for things to consider. And so there's another piece with that Charisse Loader, who's a physician, you know, convened a whole group of us to think about sort of curriculum for medical students around reproductive justice. And she was part of the Michigan RJ MedEd project. And, you know, we did this, produced this article in like the Journal of Medical Education. Sam has it somewhere. And it was based on some convenings that we had with, yes, academics and activists. And like, that's part of the title is like academics and activists bridging divides between like learning about these things. And it was also important for us to like go to part of grand rounds, right? Because I think people also have a lot of ideas about like, oh, here's what people should do, but without having much experience in their space and like understanding the structure of those spaces. And so as to not reproduce that sort of colonizing sort of logic, like what does it mean to think about what ideally would like, you know, people in the medical profession to be doing around reproductive justice and learning, right? And so understanding what's important to them. And so those sort of opportunities have been, I think they're a contribution in the way of like having impact on, you know, curriculums, but also in the sense of like, oh, showing, particularly for future generations, like, all right, there are some spaces where you can connect with people, right? It doesn't just have to always be this solo endeavor. So that's what I think about there.
Great. I do hear sort of a thread among each of you, how it comes up that, you know, the academic spaces and the practice spaces and the activist spaces aren't really connecting necessarily in fluid ways. And it takes a lot of effort to bring it together and have these conversations so that there's an impact and there's movement. So thank you for sharing your experiences and your contribution, and how you're moving the needle in this kind of way. And that brings me to the final question we've asked you to consider, because we're in a significant point in history with a lot of things that are going on that have an impact or become barriers to reproductive justice. And we've asked you to consider to reflect on the current moment. What do you think are the pressing issues, and how might social work use the reproductive justice framework to respond to these pressing issues?
I can bring it home as the first again. I am so concerned that, you know, in recent days, you know, just prior to this presentation, several states have passed some of the most restrictive abortion legislation we've yet to see. So according to the Guttmacher Institute, 29 states have policies that demonstrate hostility to abortion rights, and nearly 40 million US identified women aged 13 to 44 live in such states. Here are a few really frightening examples. There's a ban in Arizona with no exceptions for rape, incest, or fetal anomaly. There's a ban in Kentucky banning abortion after 15 weeks with no exceptions. What's especially frightening about this is that the governor of Kentucky vetoed that law, and then his veto was overridden by the legislature. So that is in effect. In Florida, there is a ban that makes no exceptions for rape or incest. Fetal anomaly is permitted if 2 doctors document the need for abortion. As we know, in Mississippi, there is a ban going up toward the Supreme Court based on 15 weeks, and this is challenging the viability standard of Roe v. Wade. There's a ban in Texas after 6 weeks, and in which private citizens are deputized to enforce, which means they can sue anyone that helps a person get an abortion. And Oklahoma has just signed a similar law, I think actually today. So I think we are already post Roe v. Wade. There are very few state Supreme Courts that are challenging these, and these are affecting access. And, you know, just to give you a little deeper idea, depending on the state, public funds might not be able to be used for abortion. Some states actually need you to provide this kind of state mandated discussion as an abortion provider about the links between abortion and breast cancer, which there's no scientific evidence linking those. And yet some states require a physician to engage in such counseling. Oftentimes patients seeking abortions may be required to wait a specific amount of time. And right now, because Texas and Oklahoma are now restricted, other surrounding states are turning abortion patients away. There has been criminalization of people who are seeking or have had abortions. There's a list on Twitter compiled by the author Jessica Valenti, but I just wanted to give you a brief example. A woman in Utah charged with murder after one of her twins was stillborn because she refused a C-section. A woman in Indiana sentenced to 20 years in prison for feticide, who said she had a miscarriage and there were no traces of abortion medication found in her blood work. And I could go on and on. One of the things I dealt with most recently, and that I deal with quite frequently in the state of New Jersey, a death certificate is required for people who are having abortions. So imagine being wheeled off to surgery and then being given a death certificate to sign. And if I have a moment, I'd like to read the testimony of a person who gave me permission to read a letter that they wrote to their provider. It has been, all identifying information has been removed, but I'd like to just give you an idea of the impact of what such an experience can look like for a person who's terminating for a fetal anomaly. And this person says to their doctor, "Shortly before my surgery, you came by and reviewed your final surgical checks with me. At the end of our conversation, you presented to me a death certificate you asked me to complete. You went on to explain that this is one of the worst parts of your job, and unfortunately, the hospital requires this paperwork to be completed. I remember staring at the piece of paper and saying out loud to you, but the baby doesn't have a name. You told me to fill it out anyway. You walked away and I was left with the pen and form. I silently sobbed filling out the form. Staring at the form's header, death certificate, and baby's name section. This one form raised so many questions that I simply never had answers to. Was I supposed to name my baby right now? My husband and I never finalized the baby's name. More importantly, I kept asking myself, why would the baby need a death certificate if a birth certificate never existed for the fetus? You came back over to me and I provided you with an incomplete, only partially filled out document. You probably have the death certificate conversation multiple times a day preoperatively with patients. Maybe it is routine for you, but I kept wondering why I had to have a physical reminder of what occurred earlier that day. Was I supposed to expect a copy of it in the mail? What do I do when it shows up? Why was I asked to fill out a death certificate form at all, let alone at my most vulnerable time immediately before surgery? The event was shocking, and as much as I could prepare mentally for the termination, I was not prepared to complete a death certificate on my fetus that was never physically alive outside my womb. I continue to lose sleep. I've sought out professional counseling to help me navigate my loss and grief. This form has caused me repeated trauma in my mind. I'm aware that I made the decision to end my pregnancy and I do not regret my choice, but it was not my choice to fill out a death certificate. So more broadly, what if Roe fails? Our patients usually find out about anomalies later in pregnancy, and time to access abortion is already precious. Imagine now having to travel out of state to end a pregnancy. Imagine paying $15,000 upfront in cash at an abortion clinic just for the procedure, not to mention cost of travel, lodging, and childcare. Imagine the psychological trauma of having to carry an affected pregnancy to term and being forced to give birth to a baby with a limited life. And of course, you know, as goes without saying in this presentation, research indicates that people of color, disability, and queer status already have trouble accessing timely abortion care. So social workers need to speak up and act out. We need to help our clients narrate their stories and use our privilege to promote them. We need to write and call our local and state representatives over and over again. We need to donate to abortion funds because there are going to be many people who need abortions, who need to travel, and who will need financial support. We really need to start pushing medical providers to provide true informed consent so that pregnant people can know sooner what they want to do about a pregnancy. We need to press CSWE for mandated education on reproductive justice. We have voices and we have used them across history for a variety of causes. We have agitated and we have connected and linked arms. And yet, the silence still when it comes to reproductive justice is still quite loud. So my hope is with the abundance of people that came today, they're frustrated and perhaps they're terrified. Perhaps you're terrified that your bodily autonomy is now going to be restricted by someone who is not you. Because our patients can become ourselves and we can become our patients. So I think now is the time for explicit, outspoken advocacy to address these issues that are hitting very, very close to home.
Thank you.
Yeah, so powerful for sure. No, I agree with everything. Yeah, it's alarming. And I think that the draconian laws, you know, that we're seeing state-sanctioned violence against communities of color. We have ridiculous legislation either planned or passing affecting LGBTQ plus communities, and then layering on the intersections of the many other dimensions of reproductive justice onto this. Is just the harm being done is unconscionable and it's exponential. And then I think about voter suppression laws and just how many elected officials there seem to be who have such a vested interest and passion for stripping people's rights and autonomy away from them, particularly with regard to their bodies and reproduction and choices to not have a child, to not have a baby, to not become pregnant, to not continue a pregnancy, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. I remember citing from Guttmacher Institute years ago, a stat, it was probably 5 years ago, saying that with each passing year, there have been more and more federal and state level challenges to anti-choice kinds of measures being brought up, all sorts of different dimensions of reproductive health. And then I saw that last year, 2021, broke all of those records. So it's becoming so increasingly polarized. So then if we're preventing people, certain people, from voting, we're never going to get rid of these terrible policymakers who continue to make all of these just awful decisions and stripping away of rights for people. So I think we have to have a more targeted, I think we have to foreground policy and advocacy, not as this, one required class in a social work program or as an afterthought. And I don't think we can allow for folks, especially who do so-called micro, more individual level practice, to say, well, I'm more of an individual practitioner. I think that it's part of all of our as social workers core job description to be advocates, and that's challenging systems and structural inequities too. And really, what better people than the folks who are seeing these narratives and these realities every day in their practice with individuals and families to use, to Erica's point, their privilege to amplify those voices. So those stories do shape policy. So I think we have to make policy as not, just like some little pocket of what we do as social workers, but really put it on a front burner more intentionally, along with what I said earlier, just about making reproductive justice tenets more visible, even if not required within our curricula. And we're always trying to push ourselves to do better and to do more with regard to making our curricula and our syllabi reflect more tenets of diversity and equity and inclusion. And I can't really think of a better example than teaching some of this through a reproductive justice framework, because it's one of the most integrated and intersectional examples of how people are impacted and affected by the many different dimensions of these topics. So I think that's really important. And I think then for those of us who are involved in research as well, we just have to be more intentional about who we're including in research. We can't rely on convenience samples because that's not really where the locus of oppression is usually occurring. We have to shift toward samples of maybe inconvenience, like thinking about why is it that people are not able to participate or wanting to participate or even trust participating in research to get their voices into the narrative that goes on to shape policy. So thinking about how we're doing things, how we're recruiting, how we're setting up our designs. And then, I'm guilty of this too, where it's like, well, for example, I'm not a disability scholar. I can't really, like, what do I know about that? But I have to challenge myself. Like, I have to ask questions. I have to think about the design of my study. I have to do things that, maybe I'm not an expert in, but just because I'm not an expert in it doesn't mean the person participating doesn't view that as one of the, predominant things that they're thinking about or that impacts their lives. So just trying to have a more intersectional lens on how we design everything to do with our research and how we carry it out and even how we analyze our results, I think is really important. And that really could speak to the reproductive justice framework more authentically as well.
Thank you. And Zakiya?
Yes, thank you. And I will try to integrate a couple answers to the questions, some of the questions that have been coming into my answer. So I think, the important thing, or one of the important things around reproductive justice, right, is that, yes, it's a framework and a movement, it's also a practice. And I think that that's something that has been really big, and like learning that, right, in practice can be uncomfortable, right, because learning new things requires acknowledging don't know everything. You got to be uncomfortable. And I think that's something that has been really great for me, as challenging as it has been at times in being in reproductive justice spaces. And it's not just like for observation and voyeurism, right? And I think that that's something that sort of partially distinguishes some of the folks who see reproductive justice as like just like a sort of analytic framework, and those who think about it as a way towards liberation, right? And so I think, that social workers would do well to support what grassroots community organizers are already doing. Like, there's been folks, there's already a reproductive justice movement. It was coalescing. It's been around for decades. There's lots of work that's going on. People have been saying for decades what they want and need, and working to have voices heard, sometimes much more successfully than others. There's been some policy wins and then policy setbacks, right? I think that there isn't a need to like reinvent the wheel. And there's already folks who are saying, here's what we want. And one of the things I think about with movements in general is I think of them kind of like as a conversation. And I will acknowledge this, comes from a conversation I was having with the movement organizer, Poonam Dreyfus Pai. And, and if you're thinking about movements as conversations, right, when you see two people talking, you don't just go in and bust it up and be like, and now I'm going to talk about da, 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 da. Like, no, like you walk up, you get a sense for what they're talking about. You probably introduce yourself, right? And see where it makes sense for you to like be in there, right? because they were having a conversation before you got there. And they already have some context and some things they're thinking about. And so I think if you think of movement, space and involvement as conversations, right, it makes it much more clear that we all have some listening to do, and there's times we talk and there's times we listen. And I think one of the big things also about reproductive justice is that the leadership is supposed to be taken from the people most affected by the issues. And that's also one of the big challenges of reproductive justice. And what I mean by challenges is that the people most affected by whether it's restrictive abortion legislation, lack of health care, all of this, right? Like folks of color, poor folks who are disproportionately folks of color, but not exclusively, right? And what that means to shift power for a lot of folks, that's actually really uncomfortable, because it goes, oh, it means I won't necessarily be at the center of the conversation. No, you won't. And so for me, that's actually really important to think about regarding reproductive justice. And if you look at the books, Radical Reproductive Justice and others, they talk about like sort of thinking about like what makes something reproductive justice. And I remember in my early research, there were a lot of folks who were, concerned. They were like, we're starting to see it, co-optation of the phrase reproductive justice, and people are trying to substitute it and say it means abortion rights. And they're like, abortion is part of it, but it's not the entirety. It's about rights to have children, rights to not have children, rights to parent. And, as they predicted, like, I see reproductive justice being used as a substitute for reproductive rights, or people saying it's only about abortion. And again, it's not that abortion isn't important, it's that it's not the entirety. And also the way that people are organizing around abortion issues using a reproductive justice framework looks different than what people are using typical sort of reproductive rights and health frameworks, right? And sort of thinking about the sort of intersections of movements and the work that's done. So when I say like there's already grassroots, spaces that are doing this work that people can get involved in, many of them have been, or the predecessor organizations have been saying since 1976 with like the Hyde Amendment that like, oh, it's already post-Roe for some people actually. Like now I think when people say post-Roe, what they really mean is like post-Roe for like white, wealthy and middle class people. That's what they mean, post-Roe for them. Because abortion restrictions have been, in place since 1976. And Senator Hyde was very clear what the goal was. He said, I would try to prohibit abortion for all women. Women was his language, he said, but I can't do that. So my next best vehicle right now is Medicaid, right? And that sort of normalized the idea that abortion should be restricted, right? And so that is important to keep in mind when we also talk about other conversations people have been having. And if you ever look at like the Repeal Hyde Art Project that MJ Smith, who, put together, yes, it was around this framework of Hyde, but it's saying, access to healthcare for trans people is reproductive justice, right? Being able to be free from the concern that your child will be shot down in the street by police officers is reproductive justice, right? All of this, right? And saying like being able to breathe air while you play with your kids is a reproductive justice issue. And so I think there's so much work that's already out there, right? Or if you do want to talk about, what post-Roe planning looks like, well, National Network of Abortion Funds, which has been around for decades and is, about 80 independent abortion funds where people are providing money, rides, accommodation for people when they want to get an abortion. They've been working on a post-Roe plan and, they've been working on Operation Scale Up, which is already, thank you, Sam, for putting in there, already in implementation. Because again, restrictions, people have been seeing the writing on the wall for a really long time. And, the fact is, yes, people are trying to fight various restrictions while also saying like, hey, people need to access abortion. They're going to need to access abortion even when these restrictions are in place. We know some states are going to be sort of haven states. So what does it mean to put in the structures now to make it such that it's easier for people to access that? And so that's what people have been doing, many people have been doing on the ground for many years, right? Now, it may not be, for some folks, like, if you weren't part of those initial conversations, like, and for obvious reasons, some of that was happening behind closed doors, right? So there's many ways, right, like to get involved, whether it's with your local abortion fund. Literally right now, this month is fundathon for the different abortion funds. And so whether it's they're doing bowling events, baking events, whatever it is, like raising money, right? Because it costs money to get an abortion, right? It costs money to, have gas in your car, especially right now, like especially right now. So I think that there's already great work already out there happening, which also means there's great opportunities for folks. Your providers, right? Folks who are involved with the Abortion Care Network, who are independent providers, convene sort of regularly to talk about different things, what it means to be clinical providers. If you're a researcher who's interested in thinking about abortion, contraception, family planning, the Society of Family Planning in the past few years, right? It's a private sort of members specific association, right? Has been doing so much more work around reproductive justice, right? And they have fellowships for emerging scholars of all backgrounds, and they have scholarships, fellowships for scholars of color, right? They have interest groups. So there are these spaces, right, that whether or not you are listening or watching this video later, no matter your age, like, whatever, like there's different ways to get involved and contributions to make and to join the conversations that are already happening. And understanding that just as it took time to get to this place that we're in now, it takes time to shift things, right? And so it's really important, I think, to be doing that more in community, right? Because otherwise it can feel so discouraging and frustrating. So that's why for me, it's also been, it's so important that the work that I do, whether it's the boards that I'm on, it's not just my solo sort of, sometimes I'm just sitting here in, your office working on a computer, wordsmithing on something. All right, that's part of what I do in my work, but like then there's the work in the world, and that I do in community. And I think it's really important to think about that sort of broader space. And that's why, it's great that Affilia is sort of a community of feminist scholars, right? And really trying to not just run the scholarship, but think differently about how scholarship is produced, right? All of that is really important for folks to be thinking about. How do you create these other spaces? Because you need to have that vision and be putting into practice, like the world that you're trying to bring into place on a small scale, so that when we win, it's easy to implement it on the bigger scale. So that's what I'm putting there.
Well, thank you. I think we at the beginning of this conversation, we thought we were not going to go through to the end of the time that we had together, but here we are, almost 5 minutes to the time where we are to end. But I think I really appreciate that all of your answers really went across different aspects of reproductive justice, whether it's practice, whether it's the scholarship, whether it's the movement. And I think you gave a lot of details and answers for how people might become involved and why people don't become involved. And in terms of your own experience, what are some of the barriers to getting into reproductive justice work, or even thinking about reproductive justice in that sense, in that framework across different types of social justice issues that are linked together and that are really important in order to move to a more equitable place in reproduction and bodily autonomy. So I really appreciate all your contributions to our discussion today. I want to thank you, our esteemed panelists. I know that you have very limited time, yet you spent some time sharing with us and our affiliate members and other folks from other organizations that have come here today to share their time with us in this conversation. We encourage critical feminists across all different fields to submit to Affilia. I appreciate Zakiya mentioning that this is an important space for critical feminist scholarship, and that if you have any questions about what Affilia publishes in general, you can contact any of our editorial board members with questions about the journal. Lastly, I also want to share that our event today is recorded and it will be up shortly on the YouTube link. I just want to say that this was such an important conversation, and I have learned a lot from your contributions to the discussion. So I just want to leave with like the last 3 minutes that we have. Any final thoughts or anything that you want to share with one another, or just we can just say our goodbyes. But I want to thank you again. Thank you. I think that's it then for us today. Thank you so much. And we'll see everybody.